In this inspiring story, Shaquille O'Neal, one of the world's most famous athletes, goes beyond his usual fame and fortune to step into the shoes of those who have been forgotten by society. Shaq spends a night in a homeless shelter to truly understand their struggles. And what follows is a heartwarming journey of compassion, change, and determination. This is a story of how one person can make a difference, and how together we can create lasting change. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know your location. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales like this one. Let's keep the conversation going and inspire others to make a difference. Big Shaq, also known as Shaquille O'Neal, was sitting in his massive mansion on the outskirts of Los Angeles one chilly evening. The NBA legend was winding down after a busy day filled with business meetings, charity events, and interviews. Despite all of his success, something inside him felt incomplete. He had always given generously to causes he cared about, but lately, something had been weighing on his mind. Something that was harder to ignore as he grew older. Shaq had always been known for his towering presence on the basketball court, but off the court, he was known for his larger-than-life personality and his love for making people laugh. He wasn't just a star, he was a mentor, a philanthropist, a businessman, and most importantly, someone who cared about the world around him. But despite all his efforts, there was still something bothering him, something that didn't sit right. Shaq had heard countless stories about the homeless population in the U.S., but they were often just statistics or heart-wrenching news reports. The media painted a picture of people living on the streets, struggling to survive, with no hope for a better future. But for Shaq, these stories never seemed to feel real. Sure, he gave money to shelters and supported programs that helped homeless people, but he hadn't fully understood what it was really like for them. He had always been a man of action, but somehow he felt disconnected from this issue. He had never experienced it firsthand, and that bothered him. One evening, after finishing dinner, Shaq sat on his couch, deep in thought. The images of homeless people on the streets of Los Angeles kept flashing through his mind. The city was beautiful, but the contrast of wealth and poverty was stark. It wasn't something that could be ignored. His mind began racing as he thought of ways he could make a real difference. Then, an idea struck him. What if he could truly understand the struggles of the homeless? What if, for just one night, he could experience their reality? He wanted to feel what they felt, to see the world through their eyes, so he could truly help in a meaningful way. The more Shaq thought about it, the more determined he became. He didn't want to just donate money or attend charity galas. He wanted to do something personal, something that could raise awareness in a way no one had ever done before. He wanted to be a voice for the voiceless, but he knew he had to experience their lives before he could speak for them. The plan was set. Shaq would secretly spend one night in a homeless shelter. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but that was the point. He wanted to understand the hardships they faced every day, what it felt like to go to sleep uncertain of what the next day would bring. He needed to feel the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, and the frustration that came with being homeless. Shaq's decision wasn't made lightly. He didn't want to exploit the homeless for the sake of a good story. This wasn't about him. It was about understanding their pain and using his platform to make a real difference. He would tell his story, not for fame or attention, but to shine a light on an issue that needed more than just sympathy. It needed action. The following day, Shaq reached out to a local homeless shelter in Los Angeles. He didn't reveal his identity to anyone. Instead, he gave a fake name and explained that he wanted to stay at the shelter to learn more about their programs. The staff were a little suspicious at first, but they agreed. Shaq made the arrangements, and soon he was preparing for the night ahead. He left his mansion in a simple outfit. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. He wasn't Shaquille O'Neal the celebrity tonight. He was just another person looking for a place to sleep. His heart pounded as he got closer to the shelter. It wasn't nerves about the shelter itself. It was about stepping into a world he had only heard about, but never truly understood. As Shaq arrived at the shelter, he was greeted by the staff, who showed him to a common area where others were already gathered. The room was filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, each with their own story to tell. Some were sitting on folding chairs, others were lying on the floor wrapped in blankets. The air was thick with the scent of worn clothes and the faint odor of food. Shaq's eyes scanned the room, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort. This wasn't a five-star hotel, and it certainly wasn't a glamorous setting. It was raw, real, and humbling. The people here weren't asking for pity. They were just trying to survive. He made his way to an empty cot where he would spend the night. As he sat down, he noticed a woman in her 40s sitting by herself, her eyes distant and tired. She looked up briefly, catching Shaq's gaze, and gave him a small, uncertain smile. Shaq smiled back, but it was clear they were both unsure of how to interact. He didn't want to seem out of place, but he also didn't want to come across as insincere. The hours passed slowly. The noise from the other residents filled the air. Some were talking quietly, while others were lost in their own thoughts. There was a quiet sadness in the room, but also a sense of resilience. Shaq couldn't help but wonder how they had all ended up here, in this place of uncertainty and struggle. As the night wore on, Shaq lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, trying to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced with thoughts of the people around him. What had brought them here? What their lives were like before they ended up in the shelter? It was a world he had never truly known. And now that he was in it, he didn't know how to feel. He thought of his own life, how he had never had to worry about where his next meal would come from, or where he would sleep. He had been blessed with fame, fortune, and opportunities that most could only dream of. But now, lying in this cold, unfamiliar room, Shaq felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: vulnerability. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the one who had all the answers. He was just another person trying to survive. And as the night stretched on, Shaq knew that his journey was just beginning. The hours crept by, but sleep remained elusive. Shaq lay wide awake on the thin cot, the fabric uncomfortable beneath him. The sounds of the shelter filled the space, soft murmurs of people speaking, the rustling of blankets, the occasional cough or sigh. The air was thick with a sense of quiet desperation, but amidst that, Shaq also noticed a surprising amount of strength. These people, many of whom had been through things Shaq couldn't even begin to comprehend, were still here, still fighting to keep going. Around midnight, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching his cot. Shaq looked up to see the woman he had noticed earlier, the one sitting alone by the wall. She looked around cautiously, as if hesitant to approach anyone, but when she saw him looking, she offered a weak smile. "Can I sit here?" she asked softly, her voice a mix of exhaustion and uncertainty. Shaq nodded, shifting to make room on the cot. The woman sat down slowly, carefully avoiding eye contact for a moment before she spoke again. "I don't usually talk to people here," she said, her words almost a whisper. "But something about you. You look like you don't belong." Shaq didn't take offense. In fact, he understood. He had walked into the shelter knowing full well that he was an outsider. He had money, fame, and security, things that most people in this room would never have again. His presence here was temporary, while for most of these residents, this was their reality. "I don't," Shaq replied simply, his voice steady. "I'm not like the others here, but I'm here to understand, to see what it's really like." The woman glanced at him, studying his face. She seemed to search for something in his eyes, perhaps a sign that he wasn't just some celebrity trying to gain attention for a good cause. She was cautious, and Shaq respected that. "You're not like the others, huh?" she muttered, more to herself than to him. "I guess you've got a good life out there, don't you?" Shaq nodded, not needing to elaborate further. He wasn't here to impress her or defend his life. He was here because he knew he had to learn about the lives of people like her, like everyone in this room. The woman took a deep breath, and Shaq could see the weight of her thoughts. Finally, she spoke. "My name is Tanya," she said, her voice barely audible now. "I'm 44 years old. I've been on the streets for the last 2 years, lost my job, lost my house. I used to be a nurse, you know, but when my health started going and the bills piled up, everything just fell apart." Shaq didn't know how to respond at first. He was used to hearing people talk about struggles from a distance, but to hear Tanya speak so openly about the collapse of her life hit him harder than he expected. "I didn't think I'd end up here," she continued, her eyes distant as she spoke. "I used to help people. I thought I had my life together. But one thing after another. And here I am." Shaq was struck by how real and raw her words were. He had heard stories of people losing everything, but Tanya's voice made it personal. This wasn't some abstract statistic or news story. This was a woman, sitting right beside him, telling him her truth. "Why don't you go back to nursing?" Shaq asked gently. He wasn't sure if it was an insensitive question, but he wanted to understand. Tanya let out a dry laugh, the kind of laugh that spoke of bitterness and resignation. "Go back to nursing? Who would hire someone like me? I've been living in shelters for the last 2 years. My skills are outdated. I have no family to help me. The only thing I can do now is wait in line for food and hope I don't get kicked out of here. No one wants someone like me." Shaq felt a knot tighten in his chest. Tanya's words weren't just about her. They reflected the grim reality of so many others in the shelter. It wasn't just the loss of a home or a job. It was the loss of identity, the feeling of being forgotten by society, and the endless cycle of trying to survive without a way out. "You're not forgotten," Shaq said quietly, though his words felt hollow. He didn't know how to fix the situation. He didn't know how to give this woman hope when everything she said pointed to the harsh truth of the world she lived in. Tanya turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. Not forgotten? Then why does it feel like the world doesn't care about people like me? Why does it feel like we're invisible? Shaq's heart ached. He had seen the signs of hopelessness before, but now, facing it so directly, he couldn't pretend he understood. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing. He was a success story. He could overcome anything. But Tanya, she was just one of many, and the system wasn't built to help her. It was built to ignore people like her until they disappeared. "I'll make sure people see you," Shaq said firmly. He wasn't sure how yet, but he felt the weight of his words. There was something inside him that clicked in that moment. He couldn't keep pretending to help from a distance. He needed to do more than donate money or make speeches. He needed to use his platform for something bigger, something that would show people the truth. Tanya looked at him, her gaze softening slightly. She didn't fully trust him. She couldn't. But something about Shaq's sincerity made her feel, just for a moment, like there was hope. As the night wore on, the two of them spoke more. Tanya told Shaq about her life before the streets, how she had loved helping others as a nurse, how she dreamed of one day being able to make a difference in the world again. Shaq listened intently, his heart growing heavier with every story. But he also felt something else stirring within him: determination. By the time morning came, the shelter had begun to stir with activity. People started to wake up, some stretching, others packing up their things. Shaq, though exhausted from the emotional weight of the night, felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just here to listen. He was here to change things. As the shelter began to fill with activity, Shaq stood up and walked toward the exit. Tanya gave him one last look, her eyes a mix of gratitude and skepticism. "Take care of yourself, Shaq," she said quietly, as if the words were both an invitation and a warning. "I will," Shaq replied, his voice firm. As he stepped out of the shelter into the early morning light, Shaq knew he couldn't walk away. He had seen the raw reality of homelessness, and it had changed him. He had to find a way to help, to make sure Tanya and others like her didn't have to face their struggles alone. The early morning sun cast a soft orange glow over Los Angeles as Shaq stepped out of the shelter. His mind was racing, the images of the people he had met still fresh in his thoughts. He had entered the shelter as a curious outsider, but he was leaving with a new sense of purpose. The night had been more than just an eye-opening experience. It had been a revelation. He couldn't simply walk away and forget the faces he had seen, the stories he had heard. It was as if a part of him had woken up, and there was no going back to the life he had before. Shaq had always been the type of person to act on his convictions, whether it was starting businesses, promoting sports, or running charity events. He was known for his bold decisions. But this felt different. This wasn't about business or building his personal brand. This was about real people, the ones who were suffering in silence every day, hidden from the world that passed by them without a second thought. That night in the shelter had shown him a side of life he had never fully understood. Tanya's story, her sense of hopelessness mixed with a spark of resilience, had hit him hard. He knew he had to do something that went beyond just visiting shelters or writing checks. This was his moment to leverage his influence for something bigger than himself. Shaq didn't sleep much that morning. He spent the rest of the day making calls, arranging meetings, and brainstorming ideas. His mind was alive with possibilities, each more ambitious than the last. But above all, he knew one thing for certain. He was going to make homelessness a national conversation. By noon, Shaq was back in his office, sitting across from his business manager, Terry. Terry was a seasoned professional, having worked with Shaq for years, but today he saw something in his client that was different. Shaq was usually confident and focused, but now there was an intensity in his eyes that Terry hadn't seen before. "I'm going to do something big, Terry," Shaq said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "Something that will change the way people think about homelessness." Terry raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but cautious. "What are you thinking, Shaq?" Shaq leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "I'm going to use my platform to raise awareness, to show people what it's really like out there. I'll use my social media, my connections, my voice, everything I have. But it's not going to be just about raising money. It's about changing the conversation, making people understand that these aren't just statistics. These are real lives, and we can do something to help." Terry was quiet for a moment, absorbing what Shaq had just said. He knew Shaq's heart was on the right place, but such an ambitious plan would require careful thought and execution. "You know, it's not going to be easy, right?" Terry finally said, his tone serious. "You're talking about challenging the way society views homelessness. You'll face a lot of pushback. It's not just about awareness. People need real solutions, and those take time." Shaq nodded, his expression unwavering. "I know, but I'm ready for the fight. I've seen the problem firsthand, and now I can't unsee it. I'm going to keep pushing until we make a difference." Terry sighed and then smiled. "All right, Shaq. Let's make this happen." Shaq wasted no time. Over the next few days, he began speaking with experts, social workers, and local government officials. He toured more shelters across Los Angeles, speaking with people who had been homeless for years and others who had recently fallen on hard times. He wanted to hear every story, to understand the nuances of the problem before taking action. But the more Shaq learned, the more he realized that the issue wasn't just about getting people off the streets. It was about creating lasting solutions that could help them rebuild their lives. The shelters could provide temporary relief, but without proper mental health services, job training, and affordable housing, people were stuck in a never-ending cycle of poverty and despair. Shaq's heart ached as he listened to the struggles of those he met. Some of them had lost everything overnight: jobs, homes, families, while others had been living on the streets for decades. They had all faced rejection, discrimination, and a lack of resources. The system was broken, and Shaq realized he was in a unique position to help fix it. He decided that the first step would be to launch a nationwide campaign aimed at raising awareness about the real causes of homelessness. It would highlight the stories of people like Tanya, showcasing their resilience and strength, while also calling attention to the systemic issues that kept them trapped in poverty. Shaq knew that his platform, his fame, his influence, could amplify the message in ways that most people couldn't. He had the ability to turn the spotlight on a cause that was too often ignored, and he was determined to use that power for good. But Shaq also knew that raising awareness wasn't enough. He needed to show people that there were solutions, real, tangible solutions that could make a difference in the lives of those who had been forgotten. And so, he began working with local organizations, advocacy groups, and policymakers to craft a comprehensive plan that would provide immediate relief while also addressing the long-term causes of homelessness. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be obstacles along the way. But Shaq was determined. He had felt the cold of the shelter, heard the pain in Tanya's voice, and witnessed the raw humanity of the people living on the streets. He couldn't just walk away. As the weeks went by, Shaq's campaign began to take shape. He partnered with various media outlets to produce a series of documentaries and public service announcements, each featuring powerful personal stories from people who had experienced homelessness. He used his social media accounts to share the stories, reaching millions of followers. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people shared their own experiences, and many pledged to help in any way they could. But Shaq wasn't content with just raising awareness. He began using his resources to fund initiatives that would directly impact the homeless population. He partnered with a number of organizations to provide job training programs, mental health services, and affordable housing options. He worked with city officials to push for policies that would make it easier for people to transition out of homelessness and into stable, self-sustaining lives. One of the most ambitious projects Shaq spearheaded was the creation of a mobile medical unit that would provide health care to homeless individuals who didn't have access to regular doctors or hospitals. He knew that many homeless people suffered from untreated medical conditions, and by bringing health care directly to them, he hoped to make a significant impact on their well-being. The mobile unit was a success, and it became a symbol of Shaq's commitment to the cause. He didn't just want to raise money. He wanted to provide real, lasting solutions that would help people rebuild their lives from the ground up. As the campaign gained momentum, Shaq's message began to spread far beyond Los Angeles. He was invited to speak at conferences, participate in interviews, and collaborate with other influential figures who shared his vision. But no matter how far his message reached, Shaq always remembered the faces of the people he had met in the shelters. He remembered Tanya's voice, her words that had changed everything for him. Months after his first night in the shelter, Shaq stood before a crowd of supporters, politicians, and media representatives at a major fundraiser. The room was filled with energy, hope, and a shared sense of purpose. Shaq had come a long way since that sleepless night on the cot, but he knew his journey was far from over. "I've seen the pain," Shaq said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've seen the struggles, and I've heard the stories, and now I'm standing here with all of you, because we have the power to change this. We can't do it alone, but together, we can make sure no one has to sleep on the streets again. Together, we can make sure that people like Tanya get the help they deserve." The crowd erupted into applause, but Shaq wasn't done. He had one more thing to say, the thing that would tie it all together. "This isn't just about giving money. It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about understanding that these people are not invisible. They are human beings, and they deserve better." As Shaq finished speaking, the crowd stood, giving him a standing ovation. But for Shaq, the applause wasn't what mattered. It was the knowledge that he had made a real difference, that he had given a voice to the voiceless. And as he left the stage that night, Shaq knew his journey had only just begun. Months had passed since Shaq's impromptu decision to spend the night in a homeless shelter, and the changes were profound. What had begun as a personal exploration into homelessness had spiraled into a full-fledged movement, one that was gaining momentum across the country. Shaq wasn't just an advocate for the homeless anymore. He was a symbol of change. His campaign had shifted the narrative surrounding homelessness, and people were starting to see it differently. But even as Shaq looked at the progress, he knew it wasn't enough. Raising awareness had been just the first step. The true challenge lay in sustaining the momentum and creating tangible, lasting solutions. He was no longer just a celebrity talking about a cause. He had become a leader, a voice of the homeless, and his platform now carried even more weight than before. Shaq's work with local shelters, advocacy groups, and policymakers had started to create measurable change. He had spearheaded multiple initiatives, such as the creation of job training programs for the homeless, a mobile medical unit that visited shelters and parks, and partnerships with businesses to provide employment opportunities for people who had been living on the streets for years. But despite these successes, Shaq had become painfully aware of the limitations of these programs. There were simply not enough resources to meet the growing need. The homeless population was still rising, especially in urban areas like Los Angeles. The programs were making a difference, but they weren't moving fast enough to change the system in a way that could end homelessness once and for all. Shaq's frustration boiled over one evening as he sat in his office looking at a new report on homelessness. The numbers were staggering. It was estimated that there were over 600,000 homeless people in the United States, and that number was only rising. Despite all the efforts, the problem was still too vast, too deep, and too ingrained in the fabric of society for quick fixes. He slammed the report down on his desk, a sense of helplessness washing over him. He had done everything he could think of, spreading awareness, funding programs, partnering with local governments, but it wasn't enough. It felt like trying to fill an ocean with a bucket. Shaq leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. His thoughts wandered to Tanya, the woman who had sat next to him on that cot in the shelter. He thought about her words, her struggle, her determination to survive in a world that had forgotten her. He had promised her that he wouldn't stop fighting until things changed. And now, here he was, standing at a crossroads. He had made a difference, yes, but it was small compared to the enormity of the problem. He needed a new approach. Then, as if a light bulb went off in his head, Shaq jumped out of his chair. He had an idea, a big one. He needed to take his movement to the next level, to do something that would force the entire country to pay attention. His platform was vast, but he had always believed in the power of collaboration. He needed to bring together powerful voices, not just in philanthropy, but from every corner of society. Business leaders, politicians, celebrities, everyday people. It was time to launch a national coalition, a movement that wasn't just about charity, but about systemic change. Shaq quickly began planning the next step of his campaign, this time with even more urgency. He called in his team of advisors, strategists, and experts to help him build a comprehensive action plan. The idea was to create a national coalition, an alliance of high-profile individuals, organizations, and companies that would work together to tackle homelessness from every angle. It wasn't just about providing shelter or food. It was about giving people the tools to rebuild their lives. The coalition would focus on 5 main pillars: affordable housing, job training, mental health services, addiction recovery programs, and, most importantly, policy reform. Shaq knew that to make a lasting impact, the movement couldn't just help people in the short term, it had to change the system that kept them trapped in the cycle of homelessness. His first step was to call a meeting with a handful of influential figures, business leaders, politicians, and celebrities, who he knew shared his passion for social change. He wanted to bring them together in a room and make them see the gravity of the situation. Over the next few weeks, the team assembled for a private summit. The room was filled with faces Shaq knew from the world of business, entertainment, and activism. There were tech moguls, doctors, community leaders, and social activists, all of them here for one reason: to discuss how to solve one of the most urgent crises in America. Shaq opened the meeting with a powerful statement, one that echoed the mission he had been working toward for months. We all know the statistics. We all know the faces behind the numbers. But what we don't always see are the solutions. We have the power to create real change, and we're not going to wait any longer to make it happen. The room went silent as Shaq's words hung in the air. He continued, outlining his vision for the coalition and what it could accomplish. But his message wasn't just about raising awareness or donating money. It was about changing the infrastructure of homelessness itself. It was about ending the cycle of poverty that had ensnared millions of people across the nation. Shaq's vision wasn't just a temporary fix, it was about creating a lasting legacy of change. One by one, the individuals in the room began to voice their support. There was an energy in the room, a sense of urgency. Everyone knew this was a chance to make a real difference, to not just talk about the problem, but to solve it. By the end of the summit, the national coalition had been formed. It wasn't just an idea anymore, it was a movement. With a diverse group of people from all sectors of society coming together, Shaq knew they had the power to push through the resistance and build a new framework for addressing homelessness. The next step was to go public with the coalition, and that meant another big decision. Shaq had to step into the political spotlight. He knew the fight for homelessness wouldn't be won in the streets or in the shelters. It would have to be fought in the halls of Congress, in state capitals, and at the policy level. Shaq's campaign exploded into the public consciousness when he announced the formation of the National Coalition for Homelessness Relief. The media took notice, and soon he was being interviewed on news outlets across the country. His powerful words and the faces of those who had benefited from the programs he had already helped implement became the centerpiece of his message. But even as the public's attention grew, the coalition faced its challenges. Shaq knew that getting legislation passed, especially in a divided political climate, would be an uphill battle. But he was no stranger to challenges. He had faced enormous obstacles throughout his basketball career, and he wasn't about to back down now. As the movement gained steam, Shaq saw real signs of progress. Local governments began to allocate more funding to homeless services. Businesses partnered with the coalition to provide job opportunities and affordable housing. Public awareness about the issue reached new heights, and more people began to see homelessness as a societal problem that required a collective response. But perhaps the most rewarding part for Shaq was the personal stories he continued to hear from those whose lives had been touched by the Coalition's work. Tanya, the woman he had met in the shelter, reached out to him months later with an update. She was working at a local hospital as a nurse's assistant, having successfully completed the job training program. She had her own apartment now, a place to call home. And, most importantly, she had hope again. "I don't know how to thank you, Shaq," Tanya said, her voice filled with emotion. "You saw me. You listened. And you did something. You helped me find my way back." Shaq smiled as he listened to her words. This was what it was all about. Tanya was living proof that real change was possible, and he had played a part in it. He had given her hope when it seemed like all hope was lost. And now, that hope was spreading across the nation. The National Coalition for Homelessness Relief had become a powerful force for change, one that was not only tackling the immediate needs of the homeless, but also working to build a system that would ensure no one would ever have to live on the streets again. Shaq had begun this journey with a simple desire to understand the struggles of the homeless, but along the way, he had discovered something even more important: the power of compassion, action, and unity. The movement was no longer just about Shaq or his platform. It was about all of us coming together to create a better world. And as Shaq looked out over the growing movement, he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. It had been over a year since Shaq's National Coalition had been formed, and the movement he had ignited was in full swing. What started as one man's personal mission to understand the struggles of homelessness had blossomed into a sweeping wave of social change. People from all walks of life, celebrities, politicians, business leaders, and everyday citizens, had come together in a way Shaq had never thought possible. As the coalition's work continued to grow, the changes in local communities began to show. Shelters were no longer just temporary havens for those who had nowhere to sleep. They were becoming launching pads for new lives. People who had lived on the streets for years were receiving medical care, job training, and mental health support. Families who had lost everything were being given the resources to rebuild their futures. It wasn't just about ending homelessness. It was about creating lasting systems that could help people break free from the cycle of poverty for good. Shaq sat in his office one afternoon, reflecting on how far the coalition had come. He had been there from the beginning, working tirelessly behind the scenes to bring together the right people, the right resources, and the right strategies. But now, as the program had begun to gain true traction, he couldn't help but think about how all of it had started. His night in the shelter, the conversations with people like Tanya, and the quiet realization that the world was broken in ways that most people didn't understand. Shaq's office was filled with paperwork, reports, and plans for upcoming initiatives. He had to admit that things had become more structured than he had anticipated. But that was exactly what was needed. He glanced over at the photographs on his wall, snapshots from fundraisers, rallies, and interviews, and felt a sense of pride. Every picture told a story of progress, and every smile was a reminder of the lives that had been touched. But even as Shaq basked in the glow of success, he knew that the fight was far from over. While the coalition had made tremendous strides in raising awareness and creating meaningful change, homelessness was still a massive issue in America. The battle was long-term, and there was still so much to be done. For every person who found stability, there were hundreds more still living on the streets, still without hope. Shaq's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Tanya. "Shaq, I'm so grateful for what you've done for me. I wanted to share that I'm not just working as a nurse's assistant anymore. I've started my own nonprofit to help homeless women get back on their feet. You're my inspiration." Shaq smiled as he read the message. Tanya had become a leader in her own right. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And now she was helping others do the same. It was a full-circle moment, one that filled Shaq with both joy and gratitude. He had seen the best of humanity in Tanya, and it was moments like this that reminded him of the true impact of his work. In the months following Tanya's success, Shaq continued to push for change on a larger scale. He knew that raising awareness was crucial, but it was the policies that needed to shift. That's why he began working more closely with lawmakers to push for housing reforms, better mental health care, and more comprehensive support systems for the homeless. He met with mayors, governors, and even members of Congress to ensure that the national dialogue on homelessness was no longer just about charity. It had to be about justice. In Washington, Shaq faced opposition, as expected. Some lawmakers were more focused on their own interests than on actually solving the problem. But Shaq wasn't intimidated. He used his star power to bring attention to key issues, staging rallies, and even working with local news outlets to keep homelessness in the public eye. One evening, during a major speech on Capitol Hill, Shaq stood before a crowd of politicians, social activists, and advocates, determined to bring his message home. "I've seen the way the system treats the homeless," he said, his voice filled with passion. "I've seen how people are cast aside, as though they're invisible. But I'm telling you right now, they are not invisible. They are human beings. They deserve dignity. They deserve a chance." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've talked to people who've lost everything, but I've also talked to people who've gotten their lives back. And it's not because of charity. It's because of opportunity. When we give people the tools to succeed, when we give them the care they need, they can change their lives. They can build better futures. But we have to be willing to invest in that future. We can't just put a Band-Aid on a broken system. We need to fix the system." Shaq's words were met with a standing ovation from many in the room. But there were still skeptics who weren't convinced that the country was ready for the kind of widespread change Shaq was advocating. But Shaq wasn't discouraged. He had been in the spotlight long enough to know that change rarely came easily. It came through persistence, through fighting for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like the tide was finally starting to turn. One night, a few months later, Shaq found himself back at the same shelter he had visited over a year ago. This time, it wasn't just a personal journey. It was part of a larger initiative. The coalition had partnered with the shelter to provide more long-term services, and Shaq had come to see the changes firsthand. He walked through the door, greeted by the familiar faces of staff members who had become allies in his mission. The shelter was bustling with activity. Volunteers were serving meals, social workers were assisting families, and people were getting the help they needed to start over. It was a far cry from the cold, impersonal place Shaq had first seen. Tanya was there, too. She had come to visit the shelter as part of her work with her own nonprofit. Shaq smiled as he saw her talking to a group of women, sharing her story and encouraging them to pursue their dreams, just as she had done. Shaq approached her, and the two exchanged a warm embrace. "You've done it, Tanya," Shaq said, his voice full of pride. "No," Tanya replied, shaking her head. "We've done it, Shaq. You started this, and now we're all part of something bigger. We've all made a difference." Shaq looked around the room at the people who had once been invisible, who had once been overlooked by society, but who were now part of a movement that was changing everything. It wasn't perfect. The work wasn't over, but the progress was undeniable. Lives were being rebuilt, one by one. As Shaq left the shelter that night, he looked up at the starry sky. It was a beautiful night, full of possibilities. He knew that his journey wasn't done. There were still challenges ahead, still battles to be fought. But for the first time in a long time, Shaq felt at peace. He had done more than just raise awareness. He had sparked a movement, and that movement would live on long after he was gone.